Good evening and welcome to Read Along with Sunaparanta. I'm very happy today to have Amrita and Supriya here with us, and thank you both for making the time. Amrita is going to be in conversation with Supriya about her novel Milk Teeth, and I'll tell you a little bit about both of them, and then we'll go into a reading that Amrita is going to do, and then both of them in conversation. Amrita Mahale is the author of the novel Milk Teeth, which was shortlisted for the Crossword Book Award and longlisted for the JCB Prize for Literature and the Tata LitLive First Book Award in 2019. Her writing has appeared in several publications, including the Hindustan Times and the Indian Express and Scroll. And she also wrote for Supriya, as we found out a little while ago, at Brown Paper Bag. Is also a trained aerospace engineer from IIT Bombay and Stanford University, and currently works at an applied research lab focused on artificial intelligence solutions for social good. Supriya Nair is editor of a new publication named 52, which I recommend everyone should subscribe to and follow on social media as well, and co founder of the media company All Things Small. She writes a books column for Mumbai Mirror and is one of the minds I admire most about when it comes to books. If she recommends something, I read it. She lives in Mumbai, and I'm really happy to have both of you here with us, and thanks for making the time.
So, I am going to start off by reading a few pages from my novel. This is from the first chapter, page 9. So, a little bit of background. This is uh, this is a scene on the terrace of this building, Asha Nivas, where one of the tenants has been threatened, and there's the building is caught in a redevelopment saga. So all the residents congregate on the terrace, and this is from that meeting. Ira knew that in the weeks to follow, every conversation in Asha Nivas would course back to the gun incident. Occasionally directly, she imagined, like while talking about the monsoon and how much worse the building would get after another season of neglect by the landlord. That desperate and shameless man who had sent a gunman to scare families he had known for decades. More often, that course would be winding. For instance, chit chat about tax returns would become a discussion on standard deductions and life insurance premiums. Then someone might bring up a relative who had become an LIC agent, how the job entailed being pushy, showing up at people's houses to sell insurance policies, sometimes uninvited. And at the mention of any uninvited visitor, the interloper who had visited Mrs. Desai would come up again. This incident was going to become of old in the dull pages of their days. No matter how one flipped through the volume, one would land on this dog-eared episode. Monsoon would arrive in a little over a month. Patches of moss had already started to sprout on the low wall around Asha Nivas. Over 3 months of rains, the green grey would spread, devouring all spaces in the ceramic lattice that covered this wall. Tiles with bright images of gods, goddesses, and gurus, even a mosque or two. The pantheon had been installed the year before to dissuade passers-by from urinating around the building. No one wondered what it meant for the residents of Asha Nivas to live their lives with the backs of 24 gods turned on them. The gods had smiled upon Sundar Southern next door, the first building in the lane to be torn down and rebuilt. After its redevelopment, it had a new name, Bellevue. Every flat in the 6-story Bellevue had window grills, metal bars flowing this way and that, no two windows identical. Each window wore its ornamentation as a badge of distinction, a mark of the riches it contained. The most visible riches were the shirts, nightgowns, and brassiers hung to dry in the windows. Unlike its neighbor, Asha Nivas was rent controlled. Most tenants paid a few hundred rupees in rent, less than a hundredth of the going market rate for a flat in Matunga or any other part of central Mumbai. The landlord had been negotiating with the tenants for years, tempting them with a lump sum settlement which swelled every year, but so had real estate prices and the expectations of the tenants. Just before the meeting wrapped up, evening prayers started at one of the nearby temples. The sounds of cymbals and singing mingled with that of bells. Some of the meeting attendees folded their hands and bowed their heads. The less pious felt obliged to follow. Uh, the neighbors got up and started to leave, dragging their chairs behind them. Professor Rajwade had cornered Karthik and was holding forth to his class of one. We think our privilege shields us from the violence of the city, and it does, of course. But there are limits to it. Think about the horrors the poor have had to face for years. Not only real guns, but worse, bulldozers, arson, riots. The claim for space in this city has always been in the realm of self-reliance, And self-reliance means struggle, and the struggle has now reached our doorstep. What do you think the 92 riots were? An armed struggle for space, of course. How long could we middle-class people have shut the violence of the city out? Switching to Marathi, he added that the link between land and violence was the theme of a paper he had been working on for a few months for a sociology conference. It was an international conference, he claimed. Ira, who had been eavesdropping, was greatly amused. Shut the violence of the city out? What was the professor talking about? It was his teenage daughter who had invented mosquito cricket, where every mosquito spotted was a run, and 3 no-kill claps in a row got you out. And the bloody game had spread through the building faster than malaria. Next door to the professor, Mrs. Desai, otherwise the paragon of wifely stoicism, was known to stamp on cockroaches repeatedly till they had disintegrated into atoms. Upstairs, the Shanbag children fought among themselves to drop live crabs into boiling water each time their mother cooked kurle ambar. Meanwhile, the Ganeshans had a leather chabak hanging in their hall. Mr. Ganeshan liked to joke that the sight of this horsewhip alone had got his daughters through college, first class with distinction, and then straight to their husbands' homes without detours, and he had never had to even take it off its hook. And what about the wife beaters, the dog kickers, the tire slashers, and rabble rousers? How common those afflictions were. Rage and bloodlust thrived here, casually disguised as order, as eccentricity, as sport and hobby. That's all. Thank you. Supriya, over.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amrita. I will call on the privilege of having known you for a long time and also having seen perhaps a little closer than other people this book coming into the world and how it's lived in the world in the last 2 years. And I know one of the things you often say is that you didn't necessarily intend this to be a Bombay novel, quote unquote. But hearing you read just now made me realize that it feels like it is a novel of place, whether or not you intended it to be, because you've created this really vivid, self-contained world. And that happens to be a world that people recognize because it's so faithful to a certain kind of life in Bombay. So I think that's your literary magic, beguiling us into believing, into calling this a great Bombay novel, even if that was not what you intended. Anyway, that was my commentary on your novel. I'm going to start off with a warm-up question, a biographical question, which is, did you always want to be a novelist?
I always wanted to be a writer. By always, I mean since I was 8 or 10 years old, at the very least. So yeah, that dream has been in my mind for a very long time. The specific form and the force of the dream have changed over the years. And I think I was around 13 when God of Small Things came out. And I read it, and I think before I finished the novel, I knew I wanted to be a novelist. I think that was just something. It was the first adult novel I had read. Adult in the sense that it was not lightened. It was not like Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, or whatever kids read back then. And I was just blown away by what Arundhati Roy did with language there. And of course, I was also beguiled by her overnight success story, which was very tempting. Of course, that was something that happens to one writer in a million. I think I had to face a lot more rejection and a more, I would say, frustrating path to get to where I am.
Yeah, and that was all we heard of her story back in 1997, right? Which was that she was just this architect who sprang to fame. And I think you and I, perhaps as children, we'd never seen, kind of the films for which she'd written screenplays or or right?
Heard of her, and then suddenly you see these articles about this agent in the UK who decided to book a flight and fly to India the very next day because he fell in love with this manuscript. So I mean, in my head, that's what happened to all writers, or at least that's what I believed would happen to me.
To a good writer, yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
I mean, so foolish now. I know it's so foolish to believe in stories like this. But I think there's some amount of foolishness you need to be able to embark on something like writing a novel.
Yeah, yes, I agree. And especially if it's someone like you who, who seemed like you had a life and like a purposeful life of work and success, kind of already laid out for you. And but all the same had this like parallel track running in which you were thinking, no, this is like what I really want to do. Like this is the labor that I really want to perform. Have you reread God of Small Things recently? I just did a few years ago for the first time after the 90s.
Yeah, I love the novel. I think I read it multiple times in my teens. I read it again a few years ago, I think just before Ministry of Utmost Happiness came out. I mean, in some ways, I didn't enjoy it as much as I did as a teenager. But I think in other ways, the magic was intact because it was almost like a portal into another time, right?
Yeah.
And that novel has become the template for a certain kind of writing. So this is like going back and like praying at the source of it all.
Yeah, the altar. I mean, it's still amazing, just the force of that novel and the moral force, right? I guess we always, she had this like astonishing moral clarity. Yeah, and it's amazing how that stayed consistent.
So actually, I'm glad you brought that up because when I first read it as a fairly young person, I think it was the language that really like beguiled me. But this is the first time that I paid attention to the politics of the novel. I mean, when I read it, I think it was in my late 20s. It was many years before Ministry of Utmost Happiness came out. But this was the first time I paid attention to the politics, to the and to the anger in the novel and the moral clarity. So I think that was the part that I fell in love with now. The language itself, I think some of the effects, I think, had not aged very well.
Yeah, and the funny thing is she still uses them, which means that she has an editor who's too scared to tell her to like cut out some of those affectations. But let's come back to you as a writer. After that very pleasant detour, what was some of the writing you did before Milk Teeth? Like, what was the practice that you undertook before you wrote this, or while you were writing this big book?
So I did very little formal writing. I mean, of course, I took part in creative writing competitions in college. I had a blog which had I would say, small but devoted readership. And then I started doing a little bit of, I started attempting to be published after I started writing Milk Teeth. And I wrote for Brown Paper Bag. I submitted short stories to a few competitions. But it's still a very small body of work. Because I had a full-time job alongside almost the whole time. So I could only devote myself to one big project, and that was my novel, which was first a short story, then a slightly longer short story, and then it became a novel in progress.
Right, and that was also like a novel that changed form, right, a couple of times, which was why you took 4 years to write it, 4 or 5 years?
4 years to write it as a novel, but the short story came before that. And if I go back right to the very beginning, when the first line that's now in the book came to my mind, or when the characters first came to mind, it was probably closer to 8 or 10 years.
And I know that they've changed. I know that they've changed names and perhaps situations and stuff. But again, the core of the book, I think, which is this this change that you're describing for us,
Yeah.
Through the lives of these characters, I know that has stayed constant. So there is a core of like intellectual and moral clarity for Milk Teeth as well. So it is a novel with purpose. And that change is very much, kind of the change in the 1990s that happened to everyone like you and me of our social position and class. And it only occurred to me as I was preparing for our conversation that you were writing a historical novel. It just so happened that it was a historical novel that we lived through. Can we talk a little bit about the 1990s and what drew you to return to this part of our past?
Yeah. So at the beginning of the 1990s, I was a kid living in Baroda and then Kotra. And by the end of the 90s, I was a teenager in Mumbai. So it was a decade of like great personal change as well. And of course, it was a period of tumultuous change for the country and for the city, for Bombay turned Mumbai. Economically, socially, politically, I can't think of a decade where more changed than that one. And I think the 90s are also, I mean, it's very interesting. There's something about the 90s that seems to evoke a lot of nostalgia. Maybe because it's recent enough, but also removed enough that it like sits on the cusp of things of memory. And I think for people of our age, or even like people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, there was something about the 90s that still offered shared shared memories, shared experiences. So my novel is set in the 90s, but the childhood scenes are set in the 70s. And I was not alive in the 70s, but I could take my own childhood memories and then tweak a few period details and just move those incidents to the 70s. I think at least for kids born in the late 90s or after, that's no longer possible. So there was almost a discontinuity in our lived experience in that period. So yeah, a period of great change for the country, for the city. That was when the middle class became more well-defined, more politically ascendant. So yeah, for a whole bunch of reasons, I decided to set the novel in the 90s. And of course, the real reason was that my novel is very filmy in some ways, so it relies a lot in coincidence. And characters meet and part. They have no idea what the other person was up to in the years in between. That's no longer possible. So it had to be before the internet.
Yeah, coincidence. The thing about filminess and bookishness is that our lives are, kind of the same absurd coincidences actually do govern our lives, which is maybe why you and I met like a decade and a half after we first got to know each other. It's just that it just makes sense and like it's satisfying in a book and in your book in a way that it never feels like in real life. Yeah, so often I see reactions to your book on Instagram or on Twitter that celebrate, that really appreciate, among other things, the fact that you kind of returned them to this to this very concrete sort of memory of the way life was. And I think it's a nostalgic experience for a lot of people, but I'm quite unsettled by that because the book is not meant to be. There's something about nostalgia that evokes a kind of like pleasantness, and I don't think Milk Teeth is a very comfortable novel at all. I know everyone like kind of derives their own. Did this make you feel? Did this make you feel sad about the history that you were revisiting while you were writing it? How did you cope with it?
I'm
like, it's a novel that made me sad.
Yeah, it is a slightly sad novel. And you're right. I mean, my intention was not to only evoke nostalgia, or definitely not to peddle nostalgia, right? And let me also talk a little bit about my own relationship with the city. So I did not grow up in Bombay. I was born in Bombay, but my family moved around every couple of years. So I spent the first 15 years of my life in Gujarat. But my extended family was here in Mumbai. So I would visit twice a year, every summer vacation, every winter vacation. So the fondest memories of childhood were all in Mumbai. So when I look back at the city in the 80s and 90s, I look at it with a child's nostalgia. So my gaze is a very loving gaze. So maybe that's what people pick up on, but that was not my creative goal at all. I wanted to set the novel in it like touches upon everyday themes in some ways, right? But I wanted to get under the surface of the everyday, the mundane. So the idea was not just to remain on the surface and like celebrate nostalgia, but actually to look under the hood and look for the undercurrents of power and jealousy, betrayal. So what actually like powers, everyday dynamics, what are the politics of the domestic? So these were the questions on my mind. I think a lot of discerning readers, not even discerning readers, a lot of readers have picked up on that. But it does irk me a little bit when people just sum up the book as a love letter to the city or as a love story set in the 90s. It's a bit reductive and a bit gendered as well. But if people enjoy the book,
that's true. It didn't occur to me to think of the fact that it was gendered, which of course it is. But I also think on social media, a lot of people feel constrained because there's only so much you can say.
Yes.
So it's like a love letter to the city is the equivalent of like a crying emoji, tears of joy emoji or whatever. But that analytical core that you bring to Milk Teeth, kind of the narrative engine, is actually a character in my reading. That's Ira, right? Who's a journalist and whose job it is to peel back these layers of change and decay that you reveal to us. What is the kind of work that went into the creation of Ira, who I think is a little bit like you, but who in the novel is not? I mean, she's nothing like you.
Yeah. So I think the choice to make Ira a civic beat journalist was a very good one. One of the questions on my mind was, so I did want to write a novel about cities and what cities mean to people. And Mumbai is the city I know best, so I ended up setting the novel there. And I wanted to explore the city, like examine the city through the eyes of a woman, because I don't remember too many novels. Maybe this has changed in the last 5-10 years. The Neapolitan novels come to mind. But I can't think of too many novels where you explore the city through the eyes of a woman, where you have a woman walking around the city, making sense of it, taking in the city, making sense of it, commenting on the built environment and how it changes. So I wanted to do that, and making her a civic beat journalist was a very convenient way of meeting this goal. I had to do a lot of research. So I interviewed for the novel at least 25 to 30 people, and these were long, hour to hour long interviews. I interviewed about 5 or 6 civic beat journalists, some of whom started their careers in the 90s and some of whom are active now. I managed to get into the BMC building because somebody smuggled me in as an intern. And that's like a little bit that made its way to the novel as well, where Ira smuggles in cares as an intern. So I went to the corporation meeting, and I spent a lot of time at Asiatic Library going through press archives, so reading the city pages from newspapers in the 90s, just to get a sense for what kind of stories Ira might be looking at.
I want to move smoothly from that to a person to what I'm going to describe as the great love of Ira's life, even though I actually don't believe that that's the case. But I'll come back and contradict myself later. The great love of Ira's life is Kez, whom she smuggles in as an intern to the BMC building, among other things. Kez is the most Bombayite of your kind. He's most recognizably Bombay in that he could have been a character in a 1970s Hindi movie. He could have been like he could have been a Prithvi type or an NCPA type, or so many of these types that kind of made it into the Illustrated Weekly of India or into popular culture and were kind of disseminated as a certain style of Bombay person. Yet I think Kes is also the sort of person who's most removed, not only from who you are as a writer and who I am as a reader, but perhaps from a bunch of us. Talk to us about the creation of Kes. My argument is over here that what you wrote with Kes was actually like you wrote a Delhi boy.
Yes.
Into like a Bombay setting.
That's a very astute observation. Supriya, you're the first person to point it out. That is totally the case. Kes, the character came to mind when I first read Suitable Boy, and I wanted to write fan fiction to Suitable Boy, and I knew there would be a character called Kes who would share his initials with Kabir Durrani and Kes Diwani.
Yes.
Of course, that wasn't. In some ways, I can say Minty started as fan fiction to Suitable Boy, but that's not really the case. The characters did, but then they ended up going in a very different direction.
It was an alternate universe.
Yes, alternate universe. But I think my experiences in Delhi did shape Kes, and in fact, it also allowed me to write Milk Tea. So I lived in Delhi for 5 years. I moved to Delhi in my late 20s, around the time I started writing Milk Tea. And I was in the US for 6 years before that. And in Delhi, I suddenly, it was like I stepped into a world that I was not familiar with at all. And I was surrounded by writers and journalists and lawyers and academics. And it was all utterly fascinating. And I think that also, I think for the first year or two I was there, I was also a little confused and dumbfounded and awestruck. I was trying to make sense of who I was and where I fit in this new world. And I remember thinking that I was it's a bit dramatic. I remember thinking that I was a middle class immigrant into upper class India suddenly. And I say middle class, I don't say middle income. Those are two very different things.
Yeah.
And I think my years in Delhi helped me reflect on my own childhood, my own family, my upbringing, and some of the comments around middle class families and about how, of course, nobody who's actually nobody who's middle class or who calls themselves middle class is middle income, right? All of us are
correct. Are rich.
Top 2% income-wise. So what people call middle class, I think, is like a separation from the world of power, from corridors of power, and it's also a separation from the world of ideas. So this was something that I used to think a lot about when I was in Delhi. And Kes, as well as his friends, are essentially versions of different people that I met in my 5 years in Delhi. In fact, one of the comments that Kes's friend Ananya makes about the first coat of paint, a close friend of mine actually said about somebody else.
We may have listeners who are not familiar with that. So could you explain the situation of the Kes Ananya exchange?
Yeah, so Ira is in a relationship with Kes, who's a Malabar Hill boy from a very well-to-do family, and he's surrounded by a large group of left liberal friends, I would say. And one of them is a friend who makes Ira very uncomfortable. This friend called Ananya, who is talking to Kes about someone she was in a relationship with in the past, someone who came from a business family and is now dating a writer and suddenly sees himself as a cultured person. And she says, oh, he's the first person in his family to pick up a book that's not a ledger. And, culture and cultural capital are not sexually transmitted. You don't just pick it up from dating a writer. And of course, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, the first coat of paint always shows. So I heard a version of this from a very close friend of mine. So I think this novel was almost in between and turned into a diary entry where I was trying to make sense of my own feelings.
Yeah, but I'm so glad that you brought up. I would love to devote the rest of this conversation to just how that dynamic plays out, because you and I were neighbors in Delhi, and so we kind of the one of the well springs of this novel, I think, is something that you and I both have in common. But I want to return to something you said earlier, which was about your relationship with a suitable boy. And in spite of the fact that I knew that you liked the novel, it wasn't until I was thinking about it recently. And in fact, given the kerfuffle around a suitable boy that is happening right now, that I made the connection between Lata and Kabir in A Suitable Boy, who are a young, lovely Hindu-Muslim couple who don't make it, who have a failed romance. And Ira and Kez in your novel, who try very hard to, and who genuinely love each other, but who slip away from each other. I feel like, I mean, even though this book came into the new India, right? We're seeing newer Indias emerge every day. So I want to talk about what it means to write like Hindu-Muslim romance at this time. What were you hoping to convey to your readers? What were the fears that you had, if any? And what have the reactions to that been?
Yeah, I mean, it's only because the novel is set in the 90s that I did not have to use that deplorable term love jihad, right? Like even saying it makes my blood boil.
Yeah, absolutely.
Only because it's set in the 90s that I didn't even have to have a character say it in passing. I don't know if Milk Tea, were the novel to be set in 2020, I don't think I could have like genuinely gotten away without using that phrase, or at least having somebody else mention it, or
addressing it.
Yeah, address it, or have that be something that Ira is afraid of. Obviously, it could be on her mind as well. And I mean, I was not afraid at all, because 6 years ago we were having very, very different. I mean, it was a different India, like you said. It would have been unimaginable that somebody would have to pull an ad because it showed a Muslim family having a Hindu daughter-in-law. I mean, obviously, this has always been a fraught topic, right? It's not like something has changed completely overnight. So. And that is a source of tension in their relationship as well. So it's not like religion is unimportant to the plot. It's a very big part of the plot. Because being a Muslim in 1990s Bombay is a big part of the plot. It's a big part of who he is and why he acts the way he does. What was your question again? Sorry.
What were the? No, I can see. No, you're right. So I think you've kind of explained to us, how intentional it was to have this Hindu-Muslim couple at the heart of the book. And also, in some ways, and its relationship to Suitable Boy is one of the things that where it makes sense that we see how India gets in the way in some ways of this couple being together. What have the responses to Ira and Kez been? I mean, I was very sad, and I just wanted them to be together.
That's how I felt about Lata and Kabir as well. But
yeah,
we know how that story ended. But I read Suitable Boy again about 5 or 7 years ago, and I mean, I do see the wisdom in Lata's choice. Probably because I know that Harish, the character. Sorry, spoiler alert. The character that she.
Oh no! You just ruined the book. Anyway, spoiler alert, her husband
is actually, I mean, knowing that the two characters are inspired by Vikram Seth's real parents who had a beautiful marriage, I think softens the blow a little bit.
And had beautiful children.
Yeah. But I think in Suitable Boy, one of the reasons why Lata does not pick Kabir is because she doesn't see him meeting her halfway, and Harish does. So, of course, I mean, the main reason why she doesn't choose him is because it makes everything more complicated. But there is another reason as well. Like, even if you put the interfaith aspect aside, she makes a decision for the kind of life she would like to live and what kind of a partner would enable that life. And I think even for Ira, the decisions she makes in the last parts of the novel, it's not India making a decision for her directly. Yes, India plays a role, but it's like her deciding the kind of life she wants to live and realizing what's important to her and what's non-negotiable.
Yeah, we see her achieving kind of layers of clarity through the novel, even though it's at a very great expense. I think the most tormented character in the book may also be, in many ways, the most fascinating one to many of your readers, and this is Karthik, who also I know kind of underwent many changes as you were writing him, right? Is are we okay to spoil our readers for the kind of the secret at the heart of kind of Karthik's
I think the book is not.
Okay, no, I've just got to know, don't spoil. Okay, there is a secret, the kind of that torments Karthik. And if you can briefly address how you navigated writing that secret, coming from a remove, because you're not like Karthik. And you are writing about a historical moment in time that you did not live through. Just like, what was that like? What was it like to achieve that?
So, first of all, I don't think it's that much of a secret. In fact, the blurb of the novel mentions, it's very sorry, I can see your comments pop up. But the blurb of the novel also alludes to his secret double life, which is in shorthand for being, I'm very sorry, but for being closeted. There aren't many other like secret double lives I can think of. And I've given so many interviews about this already that it's not really a secret. So writing Karthik's character was both very fun and very challenging. So Karthik is the character who in some ways is the closest to me, both in terms of the trajectory of his life, academically very strong, goes to good colleges, takes up lucrative jobs but hates them, is trying to look for a direction in his life. So in those aspects, he's a lot like me. And again, I have spoken about this in other places, but I'm happy to repeat it. My brother is gay, and he came out to me about 10 years ago. And this was when he came out to me before Delhi High Court struck down 377. And then I know it was... so it was briefly struck down and the Supreme Court reinstated it. So he came out to me in 2008 or 2009, and I was really scared for what it would mean for him to be a gay man in a country where homosexuality was criminal. And for the longest time, I told him not to come out, which was really terrible advice, and I'm glad he didn't listen to me. But that did make me think about what I would have done had I been in his place. So in some ways, that was the genesis of Karthik's character. Like, if you take somebody for whom societal approval is very important, and you give him a secret like this in the 90s, what would he do with it? So it was me asking myself, if I had so much to lose, would I really be myself, or would I prefer to live a double life?
Yeah. That this must have I can't imagine how many readers that must have struck a chord with. And I feel like there are many people who maybe need to read Milk Teeth to see a version of their experience reflected in it. Perhaps many of them already have.
Yeah, but at the same time, I was very nervous about writing his character.
Sure.
It's a secret he's kept from a lot of people. And when you go into his section, you learn that his voice, his thoughts are very different from how Ira sees him, because you only see him through Ira's eyes in the first 2/3 of the novel. And then suddenly there's a jolt because he's a different person. And he's not a very pleasant person necessarily, because he clearly has low self-esteem. And I don't know if it's, yeah, he has low self-esteem. And there's some low level of self-loathing that really shapes him and how he views the world. So he's a complex character, but I was very nervous about having a gay anti-hero to some extent. I've had a lot of queer people read the novel and nobody's complained so far. And I had to constantly remind myself that he's not a stand-in for an entire community. He's one person with his own motivations, with his own story. And he's not a stand-in for all gay men in the 90s. But that was something I wanted.
I think maybe in a bad novel, it would have felt like you were pigeonholing Karthik and Kez and maybe even Ira as a woman. But the kind of the care and the craft that you put into breathing life into every individual, I think, is what makes all the difference. And whether like a queer person could love your novel or hate it, but it won't be because they thought you were exploiting a certain necessity of life in any way. And I feel like as you speak, you make me think of something that I have increasingly come to believe in over the last few years, which is that the kind of courage it takes to write a novel far exceeds whatever it takes to write a work of nonfiction. You have to tell the truth in whatever form of literature you choose, right? But I feel like you have to work harder to tell the truth in fiction, because in nonfiction, you take refuge behind facts. And you're like, okay, this is the story that I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell it to you because this is how things work. But in fiction, you have to. You have to tell yourself the truth over and over again. And I feel like, I think you did a tremendous job of it in Nifty. But I suppose that's what I want to ask you. Where did you get your literary courage from?
It's so interesting that you think that writing fiction requires more courage, because I have a very different perspective. I don't see myself writing a personal essay or a memoir at all, because I'm far more comfortable hiding behind my characters, so to speak. And I listen more than I talk. I am an introvert. I'm often not comfortable taking up space. So writing fiction is perfect for me, because I can let my characters do the talking for me. It also lets me explore contradictions I'm not a very certain person in real life. I'm always open to changing my mind. One way of looking at it is that I have no convictions, but that's not true. But I'm always open to, I guess I'm like a scientist in that sense, where if presented with new evidence, new data, I will change my mind. So I think fiction is a much more comfortable space for me to occupy than non-fiction.
Maybe it has to do with the kind of fiction that you write. And you're right that there is something about writing autobiography that is a different level of, that takes a different set of muscles in some sense, creatively, or to do it well. Obviously, you can do everything badly and lie through everything that you're writing, and you can do that as a journalist or a novelist or whatever else. I have more questions to ask you, but we're at the 45-minute mark, and there are several questions from our audience. So I'm going to go over to them. For those of you who have sent multiple questions, thank you so much. I'm going to try and cycle through so that everyone who's asked a question, we can lob at least one at Amrita and have her respond, and then we'll come back to you depending on how time goes. Audience question 1. Can you explain your process of writing? Do you write every day? And is there a goal you set for yourself daily or weekly? Amrita, this is also a great place for you to tell us what you're working on these days.
Yeah, so I don't, when I was writing Milk Teeth, I was trying to write every day. When I started writing the novel, I had a full-time job. So I would only write on weekends. And I had these rituals of writing. So I would write on Saturday afternoons for 4 or 5 hours. I would make sure I had no plans before or after because I had to keep a clear mind. And I would set myself word count targets. And then about 25,000 words into Milk Teeth, I decided to write full-time for a few years. So I took a sabbatical from work and I wrote full-time. And Supriya, I told you this, but for the first couple of months of writing full-time, I think I ended up writing less than I did when I was writing only on weekends. And I was really afraid that I only have enough good words in me to write on weekends. And I felt the well had dried up. And Supriya, who was my neighbor then, had told me something very interesting. She told me that writing actually is, it's almost like a muscle that you have to develop. So you just have to sit down and not get up. It's not, so when I had to remind myself that I was no longer following my heart or pursuing a passion. I had to treat it as a job where I had to show up every day and just do the necessary work. Initially, that meant setting myself word targets and just writing horrible. I mean, if I had a goal of 500 words, 450 of those would be terrible. But I'm someone who finds writing the first draft much harder than editing. So I think, I can't remember where I read this, but the first draft is you telling the story to yourself. So whenever I get stuck, I tell myself, no, this is not, nobody else is going to read this. I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm just trying to get the story down, and then I'll do the necessary work to polish this up. But now my life has changed a lot in the last 10 months. I think everybody's lives have changed, but a little bit more for me because I have a 4-month-old baby. So I try to write at least 500 words a week. And they're probably the worst. Every week, the quality of writing keeps dipping. But it's important to just get the words down on paper.
That
I'm
it is.
working on a second novel. That's what I'm working on.
We had a question from someone who asked who the writers you admire are and what is the work that has shaped you.
Yeah. We spoke about this briefly at the beginning, but Little Boy's God of Small Things is the novel that made me want to be a novelist, or that made me realize that I wanted to be a novelist back when I was a teenager, and I treat her as my personal goddess. But if I think about the influences on my writing now, I'm a big fan of Elena Ferrante, Jhumpa Lahiri, Vikram Seth, Chimamanda Adichie. It's so hard to suddenly think of names now, but
no, that's good. I think off the top of your head is as good as it gets, and they can buy it. Our audience can buy your literary memoir, which you can write 10 years from now, to know more. Another question from an audience member: what is it, as your training is as an engineer, what is the toughest part of being a writer? Actually, I think this is a good question because, I mean, basically, is there something in your education that you feel hampers you or holds you back as a writer?
It's a very interesting question. So I'm a very structured person. I'm very analytical. I don't know if it's because I'm trained as an engineer or I trained as an engineer because I think a certain way. But the good thing is, I mean, let me start off with how it helps me. So I'm very organized, I'm very analytical. My story, even though it's fairly straightforward, the novel is not a very complex novel, but it does have multiple plots and subplots that intersect at different points. So it's very easy for me to keep track of multiple things, and I'm very organized. I have multiple timelines laid out on paper. So there are no, it's very easy for me to iron out all plot holes. So it sounds very trivial, but it's not. But because I'm a very analytical person and I'm trained as an engineer, I sometimes tend to think of scenes as systems where there is an input and there's an output, have a transformation. Which means my writing can sometimes feel not very organic, and it often, the first draft often feels like a series of scenes that have been put together to drive the plot forward. So I think Zadie Smith uses this phrase, there's a scaffolding in your writing that you're supposed to dismantle and take away. So all of that is very visible. Like that, here's the skeleton, and this is the purpose that this line serves. So I'm very conscious of that fact, and I have to clean it up when I edit.
I mean, I think what is the easy part for you, I think, is so hard for so many others who don't think like you, that for a lot of people this probably seems like a blessing rather than the opposite. And sometimes, I mean, I don't know, all kinds of scaffolding is sometimes visible, right? Like Alexandre Dumas writing The Count of Monte Cristo, one of the greatest novels of all time. He was basically writing a newspaper column like for years, which is why the novel is as fat as it is. And I think every fact in that novel is at some point contradicted elsewhere in the novel. And yet it's crazy amounts of fun. So I don't know, I think in the end what matters is that there is a level of inspiration, right? That just, whether it sits above a visible scaffolding or whether there's no scaffolding at all, if you have that, I think you've managed to kind of charm your audience. And I think Milk Teeth really succeeds marvelously at that. So please be reassured about that. We have someone who asked us, were Kez and Ananya ever more than friends? Which is a really great question.
No, I don't think so. But it's something that, the dynamic between Ira and Ananya, very interesting, because there is some, I would say, romantic rivalry, at least in Ira's head, right? So the reason why Ananya rankles her so much, it's actually twofold. One is she brings up Ira's anxieties around her lack of cultural capital, but she's also afraid that this might be the kind of person that Kez really wants to be with. So there's some romantic insecurity as well. But in her head, no, they're just platonic friends.
Well, but if someone wants to imagine an alternative either for Kez and Ananya or Ira and Ananya, they're welcome to write their own fanfic, which they can then publish as a novel 20 years later. Much like Amrita's fantasies about Kabir and Lata.
Yeah. And when you say Ira and Ananya, because I think there is some tension there, which you could always spin as sexual tension too.
You could. We have someone asking, can you talk about how your novel is very poetic? Did your interest in poetry influence your writing?
Wow, I actually would like to read more poetry. I want to learn how to read poetry. So I'm very interested in poetry, but it's not something I've been exposed to much. So I'm very flattered that you think that the writing is poetic, but my reading poetry has very little to do with it. I think it's more about, so I spoke about my literary influences, right? And what most of them have in common, or Chimamanda Adichie, Elena Ferrante in translation, is clean prose, and clean prose with some inherent rhythm. I don't particularly enjoy writing that's very lyrical. So I like writing that's unadorned but still beautiful. So I suppose that's the real reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think the technical reason is that, and this is also why Milk Teeth comes across as such a polished piece of work, is that you rewrote this novel a lot. And rewriting is the thing that really helps kind of bring out the rhythms of the prose, that helps clarify your writing. And I, I mean, I know there are a lot of ambitious writers working in Indian English literature today, but I don't think all of them work at it the way you do.
Supriya, actually, here I must mention that you were one of the first people I sent my, not the whole manuscript, but the first 2 chapters to before I started reaching out to agents. And you gave me a piece of advice, another piece of advice that was really helpful, was to read aloud what I was writing, because
Oh, right.
the rhythm of the language becomes apparent when you hear it spoken. So to any budding writers out there, this is a good tip you might want to consider using. Just read aloud your, and if your writing is repetitive, sometimes that becomes evident when you read.
Also helps shorten your sentences. Otherwise, people tend to kind of, when you're writing a long piece of work, you can, like, your sentences can go on forever. Anyway, sorry, let's get back to the other questions. What made you choose Milk Teeth as the title of your debut novel? This is great. I think you should tell them the line from which this comes.
Yeah. So the version, the novel had many different names. I think there was the first draft was called Amoeba Inkblot, which was such a terrible name. It was just based on this game that Ira and Karthik play as children, where they're trying to name things that clouds, like this particular cloud looks like, something like that. But the name that I submitted the novel to, the name under which I submitted the novel to agents and publishers was Common Ground, which was a bit, I think, cute. The novel is about land, and it's about change, and it's about people trying to find common ground in many places. But it felt very dry, and the name Milk Teeth appears just once. The phrase Milk Teeth appears just once in the novel, and it refers to the spell of peace that followed after the blasts. I think the line goes that I don't remember, something about, let me just look it up. I can't believe I've forgotten that line. Yeah. So for most practical purposes, the communal violence that started after the Babri Masjid fell came to an end after the blasts, but the spell of peace that followed felt like hate was only shedding its milk teeth. So when I was editing the novel for the 4th or the 5th time, I read this line, and there was an aha moment, and I knew, oh, this novel should be called Milk Teeth, because it's about change, it's a coming of age story for the characters as well as the city, and for the middle class. And Milk Teeth evoke a sense of formation, of change, so it was perfect, many levels. And I wanted a short, punchy title. I didn't want something which was long and lyrical. So yeah, this was perfect.
It was really, really, just one of the most memorable lines, I think, in an Indian novel in a long time. We have very little time, so I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, after which I'm afraid we may have to call a halt to this. You can choose to answer this or not. How do you face critics who are unable to find what you write good?
Oh, I went through so much rejection on the way to the publication of the novel that I think I have a slightly thicker skin now. The novel was rejected by 16 or 17 agents. And I heard all kinds of, I would say truthful but horrible things about the draft that I submitted. And I mean, it's not easy reading criticism about your book, but you move on. I mean, becoming a writer is signing up for a lifetime of rejection. So you have to fortify yourself in some sense. And I think there's like one line of criticism or like one negative review for 10, 15 positive reviews. So I've been very lucky in that regard, where the novel has got an overwhelming amount of love. So yeah.
I mean, you wrote an objectively good novel, which was which was great. I also feel like for someone like you, no criticism is ever going to sting as hard as like your own self-doubt and your own self-criticism. At least no justified criticism. Okay, last question, which also has a very nice compliment. Milk Teeth is one of my favorite novels. I thoroughly enjoyed your beautiful writing. Red heart emoji. Did you take inspiration from other novels based in Bombay?
Oh, thank you so much. I have a lot of favorite Bombay novels. I love Sacred Games. I love Ravan and Eddie. I love Bombay, which is not a novel, and Bombay Balchao, which came out a year after. But I did not actually take inspiration from any of them. I think I mentioned this before. I did not think I was writing a Bombay novel. And in my head, Bombay novels are written by male writers, were about Bollywood and crime and gangs and slums and history with a capital H. But my novel was very much history with a small h. So it was not I was not even aspiring to be part of that canon. So I wasn't seeking inspiration.
Amazing. Amrita, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. I'm sorry if this felt like repetitive to you, because I feel like we talk a lot about this stuff. But I hope our audience had a good time.
Thank you both so much. Amrita, we have so many questions that we never managed to get through, but I think everyone is going to go back and reread Milk Teeth or pick it up for the first time just to know more about Kez and Ananya, or to know more about Ira and Karthik and figure out what's going on where. Some fan fiction is going to come out of this. But thank you both for making the time to be with us and being part of Sunaparanta's Read Along. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.